The sun was almost gone behind the wide Wyoming hills when Walter Briggs stepped out of his old wooden barn. The wind moved slowly through the tall, dry grass, making a soft whispering sound that filled the empty fields. It was the kind of quiet that felt both peaceful and a little too still, like the world was holding its breath. Walter pushed his hands into his jacket pockets and started walking back to his small ranch house. It wasn't a big place, just one floor with a porch, a few rocking chairs, and a roof that needed fixing again. The old man had lived here for more than 30 years. This land was all he had ever really known. The cattle in the pasture were quiet for the night. A few let out low, sleepy moos as Walter passed. He gave them a gentle nod like they were old friends. He had named most of them years ago, though sometimes he forgot which name belonged to which. His boots crunched against the gravel path, the only sound other than the wind. A lantern light glowed faintly through his kitchen window. It wasn't bright, but it made the house look warm, a safe little island in the middle of a big, silent world. Walter was used to the silence. After all, it had been 10 years since his wife, Mary, passed away. She used to fill this house with music, humming little songs while she cooked dinner. She would talk to the animals like they understood every word. The porch had always felt alive when she was around. Now the house was quiet. The porch was still. He had never remarried. He didn't have children. Most of his neighbors had moved away, selling their land or passing it down to kids who didn't want to stay in the countryside. The closest house was a good 5 miles down the road. That meant Walter often went days without seeing another person. He didn't mind the loneliness, not most of the time. It was part of life out here. But sometimes, especially at night when the wind howled through the dry trees, it felt heavier. Like the quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was something else. Something watching. Something waiting. Walter stopped by the wooden gate and leaned against it, looking out at the dirt road. It stretched long and straight, fading into the dark horizon. A few birds crossed the sky, flying toward the last streak of sunset. The world smelled like hay and dust and the sharp chill of spring air. He pulled his jacket tighter around him. Another day done, he whispered to himself like he always did. He didn't expect anything unusual to happen. Nothing ever did out here. Life on the ranch was steady, quiet, and the same most days. That was why, at first, he didn't pay much attention to the sound. It was soft at first, so soft he thought it might be the wind. But then it came again, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A faint, distant cry. Walter straightened up slowly. His heart didn't race yet, but a small uneasiness crept into his chest. He listened again carefully. The wind swept through the grass, but under it, yes, there it was again. A sound like someone calling out. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't loud. It was small, weak, and trembling. He turned his head toward the road. The sound was coming from that direction. For a long moment he didn't move. Just stood there listening. Sometimes coyotes made strange sounds at night. Sometimes the wind played tricks. He told himself it was nothing. But the sound came again, a little clearer this time, and this time it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. Walter frowned. It wasn't common for anyone to be out here at this hour. This road led to nowhere but his ranch and the dry fields beyond it. No one just walked down this road for fun. He felt a shiver run up his back, not from the cold, but from the thought that someone might be out there, lost, hurt, or something else. He reached for the flashlight that hung from the post by the gate. It was old, but it still worked. He clicked it on and pointed it toward the road. A long, narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the dusty ground ahead. For a moment, he saw nothing. Just the road, the fence, and the fields. Then something moved, just a little. A few feet from the gate, near the edge of the road, there was a shape. A lumpy, uneven shape. It didn't belong there. Walter narrowed his eyes. It looked like a sack. A big, rough sack tied at the top. The cry came again. This time there was no mistake. It came from inside the sack. Walter's mouth went dry. His hand tightened on the flashlight. "Hello?" he called out, his voice rough from not being used much. The answer was soft but clear enough to reach him. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." Walter froze. He wasn't sure what he was hearing. His heart began to thump against his ribs. He took a careful step forward. Then another. The gravel under his boots sounded louder than usual in the silence. When he was close enough, he stopped again. The sack shifted slightly. Whoever or whatever was inside was moving weakly. Please. The voice came again, broken and tired. Walter had seen strange things on this land before. A fox tangled in a fence, a stray dog hiding in a crate. Once, years ago, someone had left a box of kittens at his gate. But this was different. This was a human voice. He felt torn. A part of him wanted to untie the sack immediately, to help. But another part of him was cautious. What if this was something dangerous? What if someone had left this here on purpose? He turned his head, scanning the road for headlights or shadows. Nothing, just empty land. His heart beat faster now. His breath felt short. The quiet had changed. It was no longer a soft quiet. It was a heavy, tense quiet, like the air was holding its breath too. "Hang on," he said softly, almost to himself. He set the flashlight down on the fence post so it pointed toward the sack and stepped a little closer. The beam of light made the rough burlap glow pale yellow. The knot at the top was thick and tied tightly. "Who's there?" Walter asked carefully. No answer, just a soft sound like someone trying to catch their breath. He swallowed. "I'm gonna help you. But you need to stay still, all right?" Still nothing. Just a quiet, weak sound. Walter crouched down slowly, his knees creaking with the motion. He noticed the sack wasn't very big, maybe a little longer than his leg. It wasn't heavy either, judging by how it moved. Whoever was inside was small. A part of his mind whispered, "What if it's a trap?" But another part of him, stronger, older, kinder, told him that someone was in trouble. And if he didn't help, no one else would. "All right," he whispered again. "Easy now." He reached out and touched the knot. The rough rope scratched against his fingers. It was cold and tight. He started to loosen it, but his fingers shook a little. He hadn't realized how nervous he was until now. The voice inside whispered again, this time even weaker. "Please." Walter's chest tightened. There was something about the sound, soft, real, human, that pushed away his hesitation. He worked faster now, pulling at the knot, trying to get it undone. His old hands weren't as strong as they used to be, but the rope finally began to give way. As he did, something strange happened. Far down the road, faint but clear, came the sound of an engine. Walter froze. It was distant, but it was getting closer. A low, steady rumble of tires on dirt. He turned his head toward the sound. A line of light appeared at the far edge of the road. Headlights. Someone was coming. He looked back at the sack, then at the headlights. His pulse picked up. This didn't feel like a simple accident anymore. The headlights grew brighter, closer, cutting through the night like a blade. Walter had lived out here long enough to know when something felt off, and right now something about this moment felt very off. He tightened his grip on the rope. The wind moved through the grass again, colder now, sharper. The sack moved weakly one more time. "Please, open it." Walter stood there, caught between two choices. Run back inside and call someone, or stay and find out what was in that sack before the vehicle reached his gate. The world around him seemed to hold still. The wind quieted. The cattle stopped making noise. Even the crickets went silent, and in that deep, strange quiet, Walter made his choice. He took a deep breath, knelt down again, and pulled at the rope with all the strength his old hands could give. The headlights grew brighter behind him. The road rumbled louder. Whatever was about to happen next, he could feel it deep in his chest. It was going to change everything. Walter's heart was beating faster than it had in years. The headlights on the road were growing brighter, and the engine sound was no longer far away. Whoever was driving was coming toward his gate. He didn't have much time. The rope around the top of the sack was old and rough, but it was tied with an unexpected tightness. It felt like someone had made sure that whatever or whoever was inside could not get out on their own. Walter's old hands worked quickly now, pulling and twisting the knot. His breath came out in short, quick bursts. "Almost there," he whispered to himself. Just a little more. The sack gave a soft shudder. The weak voice inside was almost a whisper now, but he could still hear it.
"Please."
The headlights behind him grew stronger, spilling across the field like a sheet of white light. Walter didn't turn around this time. He didn't want to lose focus. If he didn't open the sack before that vehicle stopped, he might never know who needed help, or worse, something might happen that he couldn't undo. Finally, with a sharp pull, the last twist of the knot came loose. The top of the sack fell open with a soft, dusty sound. Walter's hands shook as he slowly peeled it back. He didn't know what to expect. His mind raced through possibilities. A lost traveler? Someone injured? A runaway? His flashlight flickered slightly in the wind, casting shaky shadows around him. Inside the sack was a young woman. She couldn't have been older than her 20s. Her face was pale and damp, and her hair stuck to her forehead as if she had been struggling to breathe. Her hands were tied loosely in front of her, and she was curled up as small as she could be. Her chest rose and fell quickly, like every breath was precious. Walter let out a soft, shaky breath. "Oh dear," he whispered. The young woman blinked against the flashlight's glare. Her lips moved, but at first no sound came out. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Thank you." Walter carefully pulled the sack down to her waist to give her more air. The cold night wind touched her face, and she closed her eyes like it was the first real breath she had taken in a long time. "Are you all right?" Walter asked softly. She shook her head weakly. "They'll come back," she said. Her voice was cracked and small, but her words were clear. Walter's stomach dropped a little. "Who?" he asked. She looked past him toward the growing light from the road. Her eyes widened. "Them," she whispered. Walter turned his head slowly. The truck was closer now, much closer. The headlights were nearly at the gate, bright enough to paint his shadow long across the ground. He felt something cold crawl across the back of his neck. This wasn't just some lost traveler. Something was happening out here that wasn't ordinary. "Can you stand?" he asked her carefully. She tried to move, but her legs were shaky. Walter didn't waste another second. He gently helped her sit up, supporting her shoulders so she wouldn't fall back. She was cold to the touch, like she had been out here for hours. The truck's tires crunched loudly on the dirt road as it slowed down. The engine rumbled, heavy and deep. Walter could tell it wasn't some random car passing by. This vehicle had a purpose. It had come back for something or someone. "Come on," he said softly, helping the woman get to her feet. She leaned against him, weak but determined. Her eyes never left the approaching truck. Walter glanced toward his house. It wasn't far, just across the yard. If he could get her inside and lock the door, at least they'd have some kind of protection. The truck came to a stop right at the gate. The headlights pointed directly at them, making it hard for Walter to see who was inside. The young woman gripped his arm tightly. "Don't let them take me," she whispered. Walter didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know what he was stepping into. But something inside him, something old and strong, told him that turning his back on this young woman was not an option. "Stay close," he whispered. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they moved quickly toward the house. The wind picked up and the dry grass around them rustled like it was trying to warn them. Behind them, the sound of a truck door creaking open sliced through the night. Then a voice, low, sharp, and firm, called out, "Hey!" Walter didn't look back. The porch light glowed weakly, but it was enough to guide him. Every step felt longer than it should. The gravel crunched loudly under their feet, and the young woman's breathing grew faster. Walter reached the steps and helped her up. "Inside," he said quietly, his voice steady even though his heart was pounding. She stumbled through the doorway, holding on to the frame for balance. Walter followed quickly, shutting the door behind him with a firm hand. The house was dim inside, lit only by the warm lantern on the kitchen table. It smelled faintly of wood and hay. For most nights it was a calm, safe place. Tonight it felt different, like a storm had followed them in. Walter locked the door with a heavy click and drew the old curtains over the window. He turned back to the young woman who was standing near the table, breathing hard. "Sit down," he told her gently. "You're safe here." She shook her head. "No one's safe," she whispered. Walter's chest tightened. "Listen," he said slowly. "You're hurt, you're cold, and something's not right out there. But right now you're in my house. No one's getting in here without me knowing." She looked at him with frightened eyes but finally sank into the chair. Walter walked to the window and peeked through the curtain. The truck was still outside the gate. Its headlights shone on the road like two giant eyes. He could make out the shadows of people moving near it. 2 figures, maybe 3. They weren't trying to drive away. They were waiting. Walter stepped away from the window and took a deep breath. He wasn't a young man anymore. He didn't have the strength he once did. But he still had his mind, his home, and his will to stand firm. He picked up the old landline phone from the wall. The cord twisted as he dialed the local sheriff's number. Out here, cell service didn't work well. Landlines were still the best option. As the phone rang, he spoke softly to the young woman. "Help is on the way." "What's your name?" She hesitated before answering. "Lila." "All right, Lila," he said gently. "I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me what happened?" Before she could answer, the voice on the other end picked up. "Sheriff's office," a calm voice said. "This is Walter Briggs," Walter said quickly. "I've got a situation out on Route 19. A young woman showed up here in some kind of sack. There's a truck at my gate. 2, maybe 3 people. I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't feel right." "We'll send a unit out right away," the sheriff's voice replied. "Stay inside, Walter. Lock your doors." Walter hung up the phone, feeling a small wave of relief, but only a small one. Help was coming, but out here in the countryside, right away could still mean 20 minutes. He turned back to Lila. She was staring at the door, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "They'll try to get in," she whispered. "They always do." Walter didn't ask who they were. He didn't want to scare her more, and besides, part of him already understood. He moved to the door again and checked the locks. The old wood creaked softly, but it held strong. Outside, the truck's engine went silent. The headlights stayed on. That silence outside felt heavier than anything Walter had felt in a long time. He could hear faint footsteps on the gravel. Someone was walking closer. Lila held her breath. Walter stood very still, listening. A knock came. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. "Evening, sir," a man's voice called through the door. "We're looking for someone." "She ran off on us." "You seen anything?" Walter didn't answer. He could tell from the careful tone of the voice that this wasn't a random visit. Another knock. "She's not safe out here on her own," the voice continued. "If she came this way, we just want to bring her back." Lila's fingers dug into the edge of the table. She shook her head silently, tears welling in her eyes. Walter knew he had to keep calm. He couldn't let them know she was inside. Not yet. Not until the sheriff got here. He stepped back from the door, his mind racing. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble. But tonight, trouble had found him. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Each second seemed to move slower than the last. The knock came again, this time a little sharper. "Sir, we know you're in there. Why don't we just talk?" Walter stayed silent. Lila's breathing grew quick again. She whispered, "Please don't let them take me." Walter turned to her, his face calm, his voice steady. "They're not taking you anywhere." He didn't know how this night would end, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't opening that door. Not for anyone. Outside, the sound of the wind wrapped around the house. Inside, 2 strangers, one young and terrified, one old and determined, waited in the small glow of the lantern. Somewhere far down the road, a siren began to wail in the distance. It was faint, but it was coming closer. Walter tightened his jaw. The night wasn't over, but help was on its way. Inside the house, time seemed to move differently. The small clock on the wall ticked softly, but for Walter, each tick sounded louder and heavier than the last. Lila sat at the kitchen table, her shoulders hunched, hands twisting nervously in her lap. She kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to open at any second. Walter stood near the window, the curtain just slightly lifted with 2 fingers. Outside, the truck's headlights stayed on, painting long shadows across the dirt road. 2 figures stood near the gate, their outlines moving slowly, carefully, as though they were planning something. The siren was still faint in the distance, not close enough yet to bring comfort. Walter knew what that meant. He and Lila were on their own for at least a little while longer. "Are they still out there?" Lila asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Walter lowered the curtain and turned to face her. "Yes," he said quietly, "but they haven't moved closer to the house yet." Her eyes were wide and shiny in the dim light. "They won't leave," she said. "They never leave." Walter didn't like the sound of that, but he didn't let his face show it. He needed to stay calm, not just for himself, but for her. If she saw him panic, she might lose whatever little strength she still had left. He walked to the table and gently pulled out the chair across from her. The old wooden legs creaked a little as he sat down. "Lila," he said slowly, "I don't know what happened to you, but I need to understand a little bit if I'm going to help you. Can you tell me who they are?" For a long moment she didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "I don't know their names," she whispered. "But they found me when I was alone. They said they'd give me a ride. But then everything changed. I couldn't get away. Walter felt a quiet anger rise inside him. Not loud or burning, but a steady, firm kind of anger that came from seeing someone treated unfairly. "You're safe here now," he said softly. "They can't just take you. Not while I'm here." She nodded, but her hands still shook. Outside, the figures at the gate had begun moving again. Walter heard the sound of the gate creaking. It wasn't the sound of it opening, but it was enough to make him stiffen. "They're trying something," he whispered under his breath. Lila looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Walter walked back to the window. He didn't pull the curtain back fully, just enough to peek. One of the figures was now standing closer to the fence while the other walked slowly back to the truck. The engine was still off, but the truck's lights remained on, as if it were part of some quiet game to make the night feel smaller. Walter stepped away from the window and picked up the old flashlight he'd left by the door. It wasn't much, but it gave him something solid to hold. He also reached for the phone again, though he knew the sheriff was already on the way. Lila watched his every move. Her breathing grew uneven again. "Please don't open the door," she whispered. "I won't," he promised. Another knock came, not loud but slow and steady. It echoed through the small house. "Sir," a man's voice called from outside, calm and smooth, like someone trying to sound friendly even when they weren't. "We know she's in there. She's not safe with you. Just let us talk to her, that's all." Walter didn't move. The voice came again. "No need to make this complicated. We can all just walk away from this nice and easy." Lila covered her ears with her hands and squeezed her eyes shut. "They lie," she whispered. "They always lie." Walter looked at her. She wasn't just scared, she was remembering something. Something that made her believe those words weren't empty. He took a steady breath and raised his voice just enough to be heard through the door. "This is private property. You need to leave." For a moment there was silence. Then the man laughed softly, the kind of laugh that didn't sound kind at all. "You don't understand, old man. This isn't your business." Walter stepped back, not from fear, but to keep his distance from the door. He didn't want to stand too close. The old wooden floor creaked under his boots. Lila opened her eyes. "What if they try to come in?" Walter shook his head. "They won't get far," he said calmly, though his heart was beating fast. He moved toward the back door quietly. If they tried anything at the front, he wanted to make sure they couldn't surprise him from behind. Everything about the night felt sharper now. The wind outside had picked up, making the old house groan softly. From outside, he heard one of the men say something in a low voice. He couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He could tell they were planning their next move. Lila stood up slowly, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "We can't just wait here," she whispered. Walter turned to her. "We don't need to run," he said firmly. "Help is coming. We just have to hold on a little longer." She nodded, but her nervousness didn't fade. She walked to the corner of the room away from the window as if putting more distance between herself and the outside would make her safer. The seconds stretched on like hours. The two figures outside hadn't left. They were just waiting. And then, for the first time that night, the truck's headlights went off. The sudden darkness outside made the inside of the house feel smaller, like the walls had drawn closer. Walter couldn't see the figures anymore, but he could feel they were still there. Lila whispered, "Why did they turn the lights off?" Walter didn't answer. His mind raced. Turning off the lights meant they wanted to move without being seen. He picked up the lantern from the kitchen table and lowered the wick, dimming the light inside the house. The room fell into a soft orange glow. He didn't want to give them a clear view of where they were. The house was quiet now, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the soft sound of the wind, and then came the crunch. Footsteps on. "Gravel, slow, careful." Lila stiffened. Walter raised his finger to his lips, silently asking her not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Walter could hear the faint creak of wood. Someone was on his steps now. He took a slow breath, steadying his nerves. He had lived through plenty of storms on this land. He wasn't about to let a couple of strangers scare him off his own porch. Another voice joined the first one, this one quieter, almost whispering. They were talking to each other, but he couldn't catch the words. Lila clutched the back of the chair. Her knuckles turned pale. She whispered so quietly it was barely sound. "They're going to try the door." Walter moved closer to the door but stayed to the side, out of sight from anyone looking in through the window. He reached for the lock and made sure it was tight. Then softly, like a feather brushing the wood, came the sound of someone trying the doorknob. Lila covered her mouth with both hands. Her breath came out in short gasps. Walter whispered, "It's all right. They can't get in." The doorknob rattled again, not hard, just testing. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the knocking. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt like someone holding their breath right outside your door. Walter looked at the clock again. The siren was still distant, but it was closer now. A thin thread of hope pulled at him. Lila whispered, "When will they be here?" "Soon," he said softly. "Soon?" She nodded, but kept her eyes on the door. For the next few minutes, neither of them moved. The men outside didn't knock again. They didn't call out. But Walter knew they were still there, waiting. Then, finally, a flicker of light appeared far down the road, a blue flash against the dark fields. It was faint but unmistakable. Lila saw it too. She let out a soft, shaky breath like a balloon slowly releasing air. Walter whispered, "That's them. The sheriff's coming." Outside, the sound of gravel crunching again signaled movement. The two figures were backing away from the porch. Walter didn't open the door or peek out. He just listened. The engine of the truck came back to life, low and rough. Lila gripped the chair tightly. "Are they leaving?" Walter didn't answer yet. He listened carefully to the sound of the tires. The truck rolled back slowly at first, then faster as it moved down the road. Moments later, the blue light grew stronger. The distant siren became clear and sharp. Walter finally exhaled. "They're leaving," he said softly. But even as relief filled the room, he could feel that this wasn't over. The way those two men had waited outside, the way they had moved in the dark, it wasn't random. It was quiet, planned, careful. They hadn't just been looking for someone, they had been hunting. Lila sank back into the chair. She was pale and tired, but there was a tiny bit of color in her face now, as if seeing the sheriff's car on its way had given her a piece of her strength back. Walter walked to the window and watched the flashing blue lights get closer. "This isn't the end of it," she whispered behind him. "They'll come back." Walter didn't turn to face her. He just kept watching the road. "Then they'll have to get through me first," he said softly, steady and sure. Outside, the sheriff's car pulled up to the gate. The sound of doors opening broke the long tension that had wrapped around the house like a rope. The waiting was finally over, but Walter could feel deep in his bones that the real story was just beginning. The flashing blue light rolled through the night like a quiet promise of safety. The sound of the siren faded as the sheriff's vehicle slowed to a stop at the gate. Walter kept his eyes fixed on the window, watching every movement carefully. His old hands rested against the curtain, but his heart still beat fast, like it hadn't yet realized the danger had passed. Lila stayed seated at the table. Her breathing had steadied a little, but she still held her shoulders tight, as if afraid the moment she relaxed everything would fall apart again. Her eyes moved from the door to Walter and back again, as if she couldn't quite believe they were safe yet. The sheriff's car door opened with a low click, and two beams of light from flashlights cut across the road. Walter saw the familiar shape of Sheriff Lewis step out first, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a calm but sharp look. He was the kind of person who didn't speak much but noticed everything. Another deputy followed behind him. Walter stepped closer to the door, his fingers brushing against the wooden frame. He didn't open it just yet. After everything that had happened tonight, caution felt natural. "Walter?" Sheriff Lewis's voice called out through the night, steady and clear. "It's the sheriff. Everything all right in there?" Walter unlocked the door slowly, keeping the chain on, and opened it just a crack. The sheriff's flashlight swung gently toward him. "I'm here," Walter said quietly. "She's inside. Those people were here a few minutes ago. They just left when they heard your siren." Sheriff Lewis nodded once. "You did the right thing calling us. Are you both safe?" "Yes," Walter said, glancing back at Lila. "For now." The sheriff's deputy began looking around the gate with his flashlight, shining it along the fence line and the road. Tire marks were fresh in the dirt, deep and clear. Sheriff Lewis lowered his voice a little. "Can we come in?" Walter unhooked the chain and opened the door wider. "Yeah, come in." The sheriff stepped inside, his boots making a soft sound on the wooden floor. The deputy followed, closing the door behind them. The warm light from Walter's lantern touched their faces, making the room feel a little less like a hiding place and more like a safe corner in a storm. Lila shrank a little in her chair when she saw them. Sheriff Lewis noticed but didn't come too close. He crouched down a few feet away, speaking softly, like someone trying not to scare a wild bird. "Miss, you're safe now. I'm the sheriff. No one's going to hurt you here. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Lila," she whispered. "All right, Lila," the sheriff said gently. "Can you tell me what happened? You don't have to give me everything right now. Just a little so we can help you." Her lips trembled as she spoke. "They found me at the bus station. I didn't know them. I thought they were being kind. But then they wouldn't let me go. I didn't know where I was anymore. I tried to run, but they caught me. They put me in that sack and drove for hours. I thought I'd never see anyone again." Walter felt his chest tighten as she spoke. Her words weren't loud, but every one of them felt heavy. The sheriff's eyes stayed kind but sharp. "You did well, Lila. You got out. That's what matters now." Outside, the deputy's voice called from the gate. "Sheriff!" "You'll want to see this." Sheriff Lewis gave Lila a gentle nod. "I'll be right back. Walter, stay with her." Walter nodded as the sheriff stepped outside. The night was quiet again now, but it was a strange kind of quiet, like the calm after thunder. He moved to the window and saw the sheriff and deputy crouched near the road. The flashlight shone over deep tire tracks and something on the ground. The sheriff spoke into his radio. Inside, Lila stared at her hands. "They'll come back," she whispered. "I know they will." Walter turned back to her. "Then they'll find the sheriff waiting for them," he said firmly. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes tired but searching. "Why did you help me?" Walter paused for a moment. "Because if I didn't, no one else would. Out here you help people. That's just the way it is." A soft, shaky smile touched her lips for the first time, but it faded quickly when the door opened again. Sheriff Lewis stepped back inside, his face thoughtful. "They were here, all right," he said. "2 sets of footprints, fresh tire tracks. Looks like they didn't expect to run into anyone tonight. My deputy's radioing it into the state patrol. They won't get far." Lila pulled her knees up to her chest on the chair. "They always find a way," she whispered. The sheriff crouched down near her again. "Not this time," he said gently but firmly. "You're not alone anymore. We'll take you somewhere safe." But as reassuring as his words were, Walter could see that Lila's fear ran deep. She didn't just believe they might come back. She knew it in the way someone knows a shadow they've already met. Sheriff Lewis stood and turned to Walter. "I want to keep her here for the night until we have a clear route to move her safely. If those men try to return, they'll have more than a locked door to face." Walter nodded slowly. His house had been quiet for so long, but tonight it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it had a purpose again. "She can stay here as long as needed," he said. The sheriff gave him a firm nod of thanks. They made a quick plan. The deputy parked their vehicle farther down the road to watch for any movement. Sheriff Lewis stayed inside with Walter and Lila, keeping the radio on. The house filled with a soft, steady hum of low voices and quiet footsteps. It wasn't peaceful exactly, but it wasn't helpless anymore. Lila wrapped herself in an old wool blanket Walter found in the hallway. She sat near the fireplace, not close enough to get warm, but close enough to feel like the light belonged to her, too. Walter sat in the chair near the door, his hands resting on his knees. Sheriff Lewis stood near the window, watching the night like someone who'd done it 100 times before. The minutes passed slowly. Crickets returned to their songs. The wind moved through the dry grass again. For the first time in hours, there wasn't any knocking or strange footsteps, but no one relaxed completely. Walter's mind drifted back to how his night had begun, with nothing but the wind and the quiet of the ranch. He never could have imagined how much one voice in the dark could change everything. "Walter," the sheriff said quietly, pulling him out of his thoughts, "thank you for what you did tonight. Not everyone would have stopped to help." Walter gave a small, tired smile. It wasn't much of a choice. "You hear someone say, 'I can't breathe on your land,' you do something about it." The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's why I trust people like you." Across the room, Lila stirred slightly. She had pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and her eyelids were heavy, but she wasn't sleeping. The kind of fear she carried didn't let people sleep easily. "Do you think they're really gone?" she whispered suddenly. her voice floating across the quiet room. Sheriff Lewis turned to her. "They're not gone," he said honestly. "But we know they're out there now, and we'll find them before they find you again." Walter added gently, "And tonight you're not alone." Her eyes softened just a little. For the first time, she didn't look at the door like it was her enemy. The clock ticked softly, marking the long night. Outside, the deputy's radio buzzed once in the distance. Walter couldn't hear the words, but the sheriff nodded, understanding. "They're tracking the truck," he explained. "Highway patrol's got the description." Walter didn't say anything, but the news settled in his chest like a warm coal. Hours slowly melted away. Lila dozed lightly in the chair, wrapped in the blanket. Walter stayed awake, listening to the wind and the soft radio chatter. He hadn't felt this alert in years. It was as if his quiet, still world had suddenly been painted in bright, sharp colors. Near midnight, the deputy knocked softly on the door. Sheriff Lewis opened it, and the deputy leaned in. Patrol found a truck matching the description 30 miles east, abandoned on a service road. "They're searching the area now." Lila opened her eyes slowly. Walter could see the way her body stiffened just hearing those words. Even though the men were gone for now, the memory of their presence lingered like the cold night air. Sheriff Lewis placed a gentle hand on the back of the chair she was sitting in. "That's good news," he said. "They won't get far." Lila nodded slowly. She didn't smile, but the tightness in her face loosened just a little. Walter stood and stretched his back. "If you need me to keep watch, I can," he said quietly to the sheriff. "I'll stay near the window," the sheriff replied. "But I think we're all right for now." For the rest of the night, the house stayed quiet. No knocks, no strange voices, just the sounds of a small home holding 3 very different people together in one moment of shared strength. Lila leaned her head against the arm of the chair, her breathing finally soft and even. Walter looked at her and thought about how strange life was, how one ordinary night could turn into a story no one would forget. He knew this wasn't over. He knew those men might not give up easily, but he also knew something else. Lila wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. When the first light of morning touched the fields outside, the sheriff radioed that patrol units were in place. The night that had started with fear and uncertainty had ended with quiet, steady hope. The first light of morning spread slowly across the Wyoming sky, soft and golden like a blanket laid gently over the fields. The cold wind of the night had quieted, and a few birds began their early songs, announcing that the long, tense night was finally ending. The house, which had felt so heavy with fear just hours before, now carried the faint smell of coffee and the quiet hum of hope. Walter stood on the porch with a mug in his hands, looking out over the wide land. The same dirt road where everything had started just last night now looked calm and harmless, as if it had no memory of the danger that had passed through it. But Walter remembered. Every sound, every shadow, every whispered plea. Sheriff Lewis stood a few feet away, speaking quietly into his radio. His voice was calm, as always, but there was a firmness to it that carried weight. His deputy, who had spent the night parked farther down the road, walked back toward the house, rubbing his arms against the cold. "No sign of them," he said. "Patrol's still searching near the service road, but the truck was empty." The sheriff nodded. "They won't get far. They've already made too many mistakes." Walter took a slow sip of his coffee. He wasn't a man who liked trouble, and he never imagined he'd be part of something like this at his age. But now that it had happened, he felt a quiet strength in his chest, a reminder that courage doesn't belong only to the young. Inside the house, Lila sat wrapped in the same wool blanket, her face pale but calmer than it had been the night before. Her hair was brushed back now, and Walter's flannel shirt, too big for her but warm, hung loosely over her small frame. The sheriff had called the local shelter and a counselor who worked with people in crisis. Someone was on their way to take her to a safe place. When Walter stepped back inside, the floor creaked softly beneath his boots. Lila looked up and their eyes met. She gave a small, quiet smile. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning," Walter said gently, setting his mug down on the kitchen counter. She looked out the window. "It's strange," she said after a moment, "how everything can look so normal, like last night never happened." Walter nodded slowly. The land always looks the same, no matter what happens. But people, they remember. She wrapped the blanket a little tighter around herself. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again. You're safe now, Walter said quietly. You got out, and you're not alone anymore. Lila's eyes softened. She glanced toward the porch where the sheriff stood. He said they're looking for them. They are, Walter said, and they're good at what they do. You don't have to carry this alone. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs slowly, like someone learning to breathe again after a long time. Thank you, she whispered. If you hadn't opened the sack. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Walter gave her a small nod. You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone should. But deep down, he knew not everyone would have. Many would have turned away, too afraid to get involved. But he hadn't. And now, because of that one choice, this young woman was alive, sitting at his table, looking at a sunrise she might never have seen. The sound of tires on gravel pulled their attention to the window. A small silver car came slowly down the road, careful over the bumps. Sheriff Lewis turned toward it as it rolled to a stop near the gate. Two people stepped out, a woman in a dark blue jacket with a gentle face and a man with a kind smile holding a clipboard. The sheriff stepped up to them. Walter recognized the woman as a counselor from the nearby town. She had helped people through difficult times before. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind that made people trust her. Walter opened the door as they approached. The counselor gave Lila a warm smile. Hi, Lila. My name's Karen. We're here to take you somewhere safe. A quiet place where you can rest, meet people who can help you, and where no one can find you unless you want them to. Lila's eyes flickered with a mix of relief and fear. Somewhere else? She asked softly. Karen nodded. Yes, but you'll be safe there. We'll take care of everything. Lila looked at Walter then, as if asking him silently what she should do. Walter took a slow step forward. They're good people, he said softly. You can trust them. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Karen and the man walked her through what would happen. No pressure, no rushing. They handed her a warm jacket and she pulled it on over the flannel shirt Walter had lent her. It hung loosely, but she didn't seem to mind. As she got up from the chair, Walter saw the way her shoulders straightened a little. Not fully, not like someone who had forgotten fear, but like someone who was starting to find her strength again. Before she stepped outside, she turned back toward Walter. Her eyes were shiny in the morning light. I'll never forget this, she said softly. You saved my life. Walter shook his head gently. No, Lila, you saved your life. You didn't give up. I just opened a door. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then Lila stepped forward and hugged him. Not tightly, but gently, like someone who wanted to say everything she couldn't put into words. Walter, who hadn't been hugged in years, stood still for a moment before patting her back softly. Take care of yourself, he said. She nodded and followed Karen and the man to the car. The sheriff stood by the porch, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching quietly. The car door closed with a soft click. Walter and the sheriff stood side by side as it rolled slowly down the dirt road, the same road where everything had begun. This time it carried hope instead of fear. The sheriff broke the silence first. You did something good, Walter. Not many people would have stepped up like that. Walter gave a small smile, still watching the disappearing car. I didn't think. I just heard someone needed help. That was enough. The sheriff nodded. Sometimes that's all it takes. The morning grew brighter as the sun climbed higher. The golden light touched the porch, the barn, and the fence, making the ranch look alive again. The shadows that had seemed so long and threatening last night now melted away into the light. Inside the house, the wool blanket was still draped over the chair where Lila had sat. Walter picked it up slowly and folded it neatly. As he did, he thought about how quiet the house would feel again without her presence. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet anymore. It wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that held a story. He walked to the porch and stood there, letting the wind touch his face. The same land that had felt lonely before now felt different. It was still wide and empty, but it held a memory. Now, a voice calling out in the dark, a decision made in seconds, a night that changed everything. A few days later, Sheriff Lewis returned to the ranch. The wind carried the faint smell of rain and the sky was soft gray. He parked near the gate and walked up the porch steps. Walter met him at the door with 2 mugs of coffee, just like old friends. "They got them," the sheriff said simply. Walter raised his eyebrows slightly. "Found them not far from the service road," the sheriff continued. "They're in custody now. Lila's safe. She's at the shelter. She's doing better." Walter let out a long breath he didn't even know he'd been holding. "She asked me to tell you thank you again," the sheriff added. "She said she'll visit when she's ready." Walter smiled softly. "She doesn't have to. But if she does, there'll always be a seat on the porch for her." The sheriff nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. They both stood there in quiet understanding. The ranch was still the same. Same fields, same wind, same long dirt road. But Walter wasn't the same man he had been before that night. Something inside him had shifted. He had been living quietly for years, watching the world from a distance. But that night had reminded him that life wasn't just meant to be watched. It was meant to be lived. Days turned into weeks. Life on the ranch slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Walter fixed the barn roof, fed the cattle, and sat on the porch in the evenings with his old radio humming softly. But every once in a while, he'd look down that road and remember the voice that had broken the silence. And then, one bright spring afternoon, a car appeared at the end of the road. It was the same silver car that had carried Lila away. It stopped at the gate and a familiar figure stepped out. Lila walked slowly toward the porch. She looked healthier now, stronger. Her hair was clean and brushed, and the tiredness that had once clung to her eyes was slowly fading. When she saw Walter, her face broke into a gentle smile. "I told you I'd visit," she said softly. Walter smiled, warmth blooming in his chest. "I kept the porch ready." She sat down beside him on the rocking chair, and for a long moment, they didn't need to say anything at all. The wind moved gently through the grass. The sky stretched wide and blue above them. They were 2 people who had crossed paths in a way neither could have predicted. But sometimes, that's how the most powerful stories begin. Not with plans, but with unexpected moments. And in that quiet morning, Walter Briggs, the lonely rancher, realized something he hadn't felt in years. His home no longer felt like just a quiet place at the end of a road. It felt alive again, because sometimes one night can change everything.